Our first speaker is Valentina Izmailova. She is professor of Slavic literatures and culture and is the director of the Harriman Institute of Columbia University. Please, Valentina.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you all, my co-panelists, for responding so enthusiastically and on such a short notice to Harriman's emergency panel on this important topic. I will begin with a statement that might not be obvious to everybody. The war on Ukraine is a war over control of historical memory. Putin's public pronouncements before he launched an attack on sovereign Ukraine last week attempted to rhetorically obliterate Ukrainian history, cultural legacy, and the right to Ukrainian language and literature. In fact, to anything Ukrainian to exist as separate from Russia. And then he ordered his army to make this macabre fantasy a reality by fire and blood. To us historians who study Ukraine and its cultural heritage, this brutal theft of history in plain sight in front of the entire world poses a double challenge. First, we are called by the urgency and gravity of the moment to have a swift response in defense of the historical truth and publicly expose this grand historical larceny for the crime that it is. The war that is raging now in Ukraine is about control of Ukraine's historical past as much as it is about Ukrainian future. And we are all called to be volunteers in this war. Second, no less important, we have the responsibility to make public the history of this theft, because the theft is not new, and Russia has been a repeated offender in the same crime. What are the logic and the motives behind it? Understanding the history of Russia's obsession with Ukrainian history and the desire to possess it holds the key to understanding much of the current tragic events. At the heart of it is Kyiv. I dare say that from the start, the goal of Putin has been nothing less than possessing Kyiv and reclaiming it together with the legacy of Kiev and Rus for the new Russian empire he wants to build. Moscow has a long-standing anxiety vis-a-vis Kyiv, which is not only the more ancient city, but commands much heftier symbolic capital as the mother of all Russian cities and the sacred heart of all Rus. It all hinges on events at the end of the 10th century, more than 100 years before Moscow was even founded, when the Kievan prince Volodymyr accepted Christianity from Byzantium and made his capital the quote-unquote baptismal font for all Eastern Slavs. The rise of Muscovy against the backdrop of the Mongol Tatar invasion of Rus and the sack of Kiev in 1240, together with the fall of Constantinople several centuries later, opened unprecedented opportunities to Moscow rulers. As the only remaining Orthodox sovereign state, Muscovy could now vie for the Byzantine imperial legacy, including the title Basileus, Tsar, for the Moscow Grand Prince. The ideology of Moscow, the Third Rome, first articulated in the early 16th century, claimed a double blessing for the ruler of Moscow, not only as heir to Roman imperial power, but also to the messianic blessing of Christ the King, personally responsible for the salvation of humankind at the time of the apocalypse. Moscow's only link to Constantinople and to this imperial double blessing, however, was Kyiv. And hence, the utility of the Kievan past for the czars of Moscow increased exponentially. And a massive campaign was launched for appropriating this past, which was not finalized until 1686 when Moscow annexed Kyiv. Finally, the grand theft of Kievan history was justified and legalized through the appropriation of Kievan geography. Sounds familiar? It should. This imperial solution to Moscow's problem remained more or less in effect throughout the Soviet period. But in 1991, the situation radically changed when Kiev became the capital of a new sovereign state of Ukraine, and the legitimacy of Russia's claim to the Kievan legacy, with all its symbolic power, evaporated overnight. The history which Russia had stolen long ago was now lost. And if it were ever to be recuperated, Russia needed to re-steal it. This is exactly what Putin has been doing for the last decade. First, rhetorically, then through more aggressive actions like the kidnapping of the Kievan Prince Volodymyr in the form of his gigantic Moscow monument, a monument, mind you, to the founder of the Russian state, and now through an all-out war. Our late colleague, Karen Dawisha, advanced an influential vision of Putin's role as kleptocracy. We have to recognize today that Putin's kleptocracy extends far beyond material wealth, and familiar forms of legalized criminality are employed also to appropriate history for the gain of the ruling clique. And the damage of that organized state criminality is much more devastating than the crimes, the criminal expropriation of money and property. And one last thought, this time much closer to home. When our educational programs are not cognizant of these ideological manipulations of history, when these programs ignore or misinterpret these thefts, we too become complicit in Putin's kleptocracy. So, teaching today the literary and cultural heritage of Kievan Rus as Old Russian literature, to give one example from my own discipline, makes us directly complicit in Putin's agenda, participants in the war on the wrong side. I would like to have a conversation about that and about the terrifying force of disciplinary inertia, about the way our audiences, our students, our colleagues have been trained to respond and recognize easy labels, Russian, and to resist their replacement. So I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina.